So, Assalamu alaikum and hello, everyone, and welcome to one of the hopefully many EDU talks on the area, the broad sort of field of arts education. So today is the first one, and we welcome back Professor Salima Hashmi for this talk. And the topic of our discussion, because this is how we will approach it, a little bit of a historical background for those of you who don't know about the what arts education might be, and then we will sort of discuss what the challenges are moving forward with it. So Professor Salima Hashmi is our distinguished guest today. She is an artist, curator, contemporary art historian, and an educationist. Professor Hashmi was the founding dean of the Mariam Daud School of Visual Arts and Design at Beacon House National University. She was also, before that, the professor of fine art at National College of Arts and also its principal. She has made a large number of very significant contributions to education in the arts at all levels, but particularly in higher education, and specifically in a subject which has to do with issues of pedagogy and curriculum in the arts, which is called art education. She started this by initiating graduate programs of teacher education at BNU in the late 2010s. So I think 2008 or something. Other than that, Professor Hashmi has made tremendously large contributions to the development of contemporary art in Pakistan. She has written a lot about it. Among her publications are three very significant contributions. One is Unveiling the Visible, which is about the lives and works of women artists in Pakistan. She has written Memories, Myths, Mutations, Contemporary Art from India and Pakistan, which she has co-authored with Yashodhara Dalmia, who is from an anthropology background. And then The Eye Still Seeks, which is probably the first sort of overview of contemporary art published in 2014, contemporary art in Pakistan, in which, of course, there are intersecting themes of education, culture, anthropological and other lenses of interpreting the arts, all of those kinds of ways of talking about the contemporary arts. You can find that in the content. So welcome to our talk, Mrs. Hashmi. And one more thing I think which is really important is that currently and for the last 10 or so years, Professor Hashmi is also involved through her organization Faiz Ghar in Lahore for extending arts education outreach to children, particularly. And in fact, this is something which is really very interesting because it's not just children, their families also engage in a lot of their programming. And so it's a very vibrant, rich contribution. Thank you for joining us, Professor Hashmi. My name, as you most of you know, is Razia Sadiq. I am an associate professor at the School of Education, and my field or background is also in art education. So Mrs. Hashmi, over to you.
Thank you. Only for a brief while, I'll be doing all the talking, and then hopefully, Razia, will kind of have a dialogue, because so many of the questions that we want to look at today are things that are right up your alley. So I'd like to, if you don't mind, to begin with a couple of images. And I think Taimur is helping us with that. So if I can have the first image, well, the first is just barely the title of this talk, which is not all that exciting. So Taimur, if you can give us the first image, please. And then we can go on to the next. Okay, Taimur has started the screen sharing. So we've called it Seeing, Doing, Imagining, the Future of Art Education. Okay, I wanted to start with this really nice little painting, not an image that you'd expect at the beginning of something like this, but it's just really linking ourselves to heritage and to legacies that we are sometimes not aware that we are part of. And this is one of my very favorite little Pahari paintings, from Guler, the Punjab hills. And it's a work by actually a very well-known artist, which is rare because a lot of the time you don't hear the names of artists, you know, they're fairly anonymous. Can we have the next slide? Yes, so you actually now see the artist, who is this gentleman who's kind of waiting for his patron's approval. This is a very well-known artist called Nain Sukh. And because he did a lot of work and in his time was, you know, was in demand at various courts in the Punjab. So this is Balwant Singh, one of the Maharajas. I think just pause for a moment and think, because so many of us think that the whole notion of art making, art education somehow comes from elsewhere. Not so. I think an interest in a wonder at and an appreciation of is something that is, I believe, very much in our genes. Can I look at the next slide, please? Okay, but you know what we think that we are familiar with is actually once the British start their business of bringing art education, not as it was known then, it was more craft education. But one didn't make these distinctions, but the British did, because they were so tremendously fond of categorizations and standardizations. So this was the Mayo School of Arts, and we have the first principal, who was Lockwood Kipling, the seated gentleman with a long beard, and the first logo of the Mayo School of Arts in Lahore. Today, everybody knows it as NCA, but the way it started was as one of the 4 industrial art schools in India. So Lahore was one of them, and then Bombay and Madras and Calcutta were the others. Can you have the next image? And what were they doing? Well, basically, they were taking children of artisans, sons of artisans, who they felt were losing some of the craft. The British never saw any merit in our art, Gandhara or otherwise, but they did see the merit in the craft because they could recognize the level of excellence of skill. And they felt that that was deteriorating very fast. So therefore, they set up these industrial art schools, as they call them, for primarily the sons of artisans. But of course, they couldn't resist putting in some of their own curriculum. And as I said, there was a great desire for standardization. No wonder, this is post-industrial revolution. So you have this feeling that, okay, everybody does the same thing. It's interesting to think of that as a kind of a pivot for what they were up to. Can we have the next image? But then, of course, you know, times change. In 1958, you had a Mayo School, which was a sleepy old place by that time, being transformed into this very dynamic modern art school. And it paid allegiance to new thinking in art education in Europe also, which was linking studio work to the study of materials and processes. So they were workshops where they were at NCA anyway, because they came from the Mayo School. But there was a new way of really teaching and learning. So you had people coming through from various parts of the world, but also your own homegrown graduates who became the first legion of luminaries in art, design, and architecture. So this is what we kind of think of when we think of the teaching at NCA, where there's a study of light, there's a study of form, there's a study of texture, there's a study of the human body, and very much the study of materials and their behavior. We have the next one, please. But NCA had a lot else to do also. We had, you know, applying all these things that you learned in the studio elsewhere, and you did other things with it. You engage with your environment, and perhaps this kind of an informal application, it was, you know, whether it was at the annual dinner, whether it was at an exhibition, whether it was for a concert, it was what was manifest was these ways of seeing and doing and imagining were not confined to your classrooms, but were there for you to put in to any kind of context that you felt that they deserved to go into. Next. Okay, so where does this come in? Well, this is when at NCA we decide, okay, we're going to come out of our pristine atmosphere. We're going to do something else. And this was just one summer when we decided, okay, we're going to go into the old city and we're going to work with children who never have art in their lives, and managed to get a bit of funding from the chairman of AWAPDA at the time, who just happened to be the father of some of our students. And we put these posters up in the old city and said, anybody who wants to come and do some art with us in the Victoria School, we'll do it. Well, the first day was a disaster because none of the children would touch the paper or the paints. They'd never been through this experience. It was too perfect for them. So, you know, on persuasion, they would put the brush in the paint and they would write like ellipse and make an arm, bay, they would write te. There was just no way of describing the world as they knew it in this manner. So we decided, okay, so let's break the ice, and we started doing storytelling sessions and poetry sessions. Sufi Tabassum came in very, very handy. Next. And pretty soon they were on their way. And there were stories that they were coming out with. They realized that this was an alternative way of describing the world and using language to share with us. It was a learning curve for the students, my students at NCA, who'd come thinking they were going to get masterpieces on the first day from the students, and learning that, no, this is something that children have to be educated into. And I've kept these images just to remember that experience forever. Next. Oh, well, as long as I'm around anyway. This is just another 2 slides of a very different time, much more recent. This is a residency, an artist residency in Murray, which is for professional artists. But as part of that, we invited in, I mean, the residency invited in the bachas who really didn't go to school. These were the Gujjar children who used to deliver milk in the streets. So they were invited in to come and to do what you see that they're doing. And they were delighted. And they were, because it seemed to them they were getting a chance at school, children who don't go to school. And it was even lovelier to see how they took to color, and they took to paper, and they looked to talking about it. Next. And then we could chat about it. We could share what everybody had done. And you know, they exchanged their own views and wondered why certain kind of mark making happened and what was it all about. So it was language, but it was also discovery. It was also, I think, for them, an opportunity simply to go to school for 2 hours a day, a school in which there were these materials and this kind of language, rather than learning a language which they truly didn't understand, which was Urdu. Next. Okay, this is now what Razia had referred to earlier, the business of art education. And these are just a few glimpses of the MA course has started at BNU in teacher education. And it was that really over this long period of time when I had been teaching mainly art and some theoretical studies at NCA, making the not unusual discovery that people who have studied art are not necessarily equipped to teach. And perhaps we need to look at other ways of additions to their education so they become educationists. It's not an easy pathway for those who believe that teaching as they have been taught is the best way to go about it. So that is just, just thought it'd be nice for you to just have a look at some of the groups that we worked with and what we were doing next. So, Razia, I think that, if we can now talk about ways other than the ones that we are familiar with, that is the formal institution in which there is art or there is teacher education. And now look at the other avenues. I mean, these are just the Lahore Museum. And this is like some of our MA Art Education students were using the museum as one of the locations where they could work out some of their, some parts of their pedagogy and what they wanted to do. Because as we know, museums should be hubs of educational outreach. And they unfortunately seldom perform this task. And so much of it, this has to do with the visuals. You go to museums to see, and the seeing then teaches you about history. It teaches you about legacy. It teaches you about identity. It teaches you about cross currents. It teaches you about change, historical change, material change, change in all kinds of things. So, I mean, so I'd like you to come in now and just sort of say, okay, so, what are the different kinds of exploration which are possible? We're not talking artists here. We're talking about this as a space for education per se, but where the visual is such a major component.
Sure. Thank you, Mrs. Hashmi, for allowing me to add this. I mean, I think it's a fairly neglected point in the general sort of narrative about arts and the children in the education of children, that materials could be otherwise, and the places of learning could also be otherwise, as in like. I think typically we conventionally we imagine art materials as conventional materials of drawing, painting, sculpture. And really, not just now, although there is emerging and also existing research on the expansion of material possibilities in what the arts might be. For example, you don't necessarily have to make something. Visuals, as you said, are really important. So, they also have a place in the learning of people who are not necessarily seeking expert knowledge in arts education, but image analysis, engaging with, as you said, histories, identities, all of those really wonderful sort of repertoire of information that artworks, and in fact, beyond artworks, images. And I would like to acknowledge the broader visual culture, in our cities or wherever we live, and not just in cities, even in the less sort of built environment also. These are all sites for dialogue. So what's the reason? I mean, this is more of a question. What's the reason why this additional nuance of materiality has not entered children's education?
Can I have the next slide, and perhaps that will illustrate in a oblique manner. We're talking here about just a project some of these students did with street children who never go to school, and working on the pavements in Liberty Market. Why are there millions of children not in school? Well, they're not in school because, for, of course, a vast number of reasons, and I'm sort of entering into an area of simplification here, which kind of connects with what you're saying. There's nothing in school which relates to life. And I think that that is where we look at the possibility that when you have visual education, we talked about materials. Materials can come from anything. When we used to start the first class of drawing in foundation year at NCA, I don't know if you remember us yet, it was a very long time ago when you did your first foundation year with me, that I said, where does drawing start from? It starts from mark making. It starts from a finger that you may put into a pile of mud. into a piece of sand. All you need for the drawing is a broken branch, and you start drawing in mud. You poke a finger in mud and you make something with it. So, this feeling that, okay, it has to be stuff that is bought in a shop which says art materials on the door is really not what it's all about at all. Yes, okay, when you want to fine tune stuff and when you do for convenience, you go in and buy brushes and paints and so on. But you can conduct classes without any of that material. Because it is the discovery of the world through the materials that are at hand that you can actually begin to be, somebody who understands the world visually. The whole of what we now call craft, but I prefer, because I don't like these sort of segmentations. The craft history tells us that you can make art, or if you like, craft, from any materials that are at hand. And the whole idea of using just plain chalk on the sidewalk with the children in the street who mind cars is really to demonstrate that you can do any kind of statement and information about the world. You can produce it with whatever material is there in any manner that your imagination allows it to be bent to the will of the child or the person who is making. Can we have the next one, please? And so, which is why when we talk about what it could be, I mean, here we're just looking at, a bicycle being dismantled in quite a posh school, actually, in Lahore. But the fact that it could be, we're taking something apart, we are dismantling it, and perhaps we are learning how to assemble it together. This is not a piece of, this is not expensively acquired material. You needed a tool kit, and you needed a bicycle, somebody who was willing to seed their bicycle to be, tried out in this work with children. But you are, of course, getting into an educational process. And this happens to be done by the art educator in this school, who understands that it is not about paint and brush and a sheet of paper. It's about something else. So I think that what we are looking at is an understanding of the very many different kinds of intelligences that a child, any human being has, and how if you don't have this kind of education as a very major component of all education, you are in fact denying the child growth and development. Can I have the next image? Okay, these are processes of the same project in which, after they've taken it apart, and there are so many things that I learned from this. You're looking at the different shapes. You're looking at, the circle. You're looking at, parts of the circle. You're looking at all of the components of something that comes together and becomes something else. Throughout what we do in art education is to hold dear to our hearts the surprise element. When children work at something and the teacher has, as the magician, has the element of surprise in their little pitari, in little bag of tricks. So the children learn how, how evolution of a particular thing takes place, how you can put it together and maybe not put it together well enough so it still works. But you have learned something from that process. May I have the next one, please? Okay, that's the same image. And that's the triumphant group. I thought we had some other images in between. You seem to be missing the Faiz-Ghar images, aren't they there? Are there any other images, Taimur? That's odd, I think.
Finished.
Oh, that's very odd, because I think then we've got a problem with our PowerPoint, because we had images of Faiz Ghar in it also, but we seem to have missed them.
That's all right,
anyway.
Mrs. Hashmi. You could maybe share a little bit for those who may not know, and because that would be really rich to share with all of us.
The notion of allowing a space like Faiz Ghar, which is a small museum, but an interactive sort of space. It's a museum named after Faiz Ahmed Faiz. And we decided right in the beginning that while it will be housing, you know, his books and his documents and certain things that he used, photographs and so on, it should not be a place where people go and, you know. Oops.
Taimur, mute pe kar lein, please. Thank you.
Okay. So we decided, no, it should be a space where everybody can come and learn. And because there were certain things that were extremely dear to my father's heart, among them was, of course, all aspects of the arts. And the idea that from the very beginning, when a child opens their eyes, all of these should be part of the development process. So we have music classes, we have art classes, we have theater classes, we have places where, you know, that we have a drum circle where people can come and learn how to play the drums. We have places where, spaces where children can come and work with clay, places where they can work at learning how to do very, very basic science experiments. The idea that all of these things are interlinked, and you can actually, without segregating, make all of these things, which are now fashionably called interdisciplinary, be part of moments of joy and discovery, exploration of materials. And it also ties into sessions of storytelling. The storytelling is usually in Urdu, and the reason is because, you know, my grandmother used to tell me stories. I'm not very sure that very many grandmothers now have time to tell, you know, their grandchildren stories, or the children would rather not play on their little screens, at least a particular class of child. So the fact that you can make opportunities for a certain number of stories to continue to be part of the child's knowledge and enjoyment, in which poetry comes into it, in which certain sound patterns come into it, certain kinds of vocabulary come into it, and they can be gathered together in collective moments. So that is very much about what we wanted the activities in Faiz Ghar to be about. We have whole families coming because in our music classes, you have all age groups. I have to say here that a very large number of them are practicing doctors. And when I asked, you know, how come? It's because so many of them didn't have the time or the opportunity to explore parts of their creative selves. And now they feel that they owe it to themselves to come and make up for the years lost. It's the same thing in the art classes also, that you find all kinds of age groups and all kinds of people who feel either that they missed out, or they feel that now is the time to do something that they were never given an opportunity to. So Faiz Ghar is really filling the vacuum, if you like. It's providing calm, joy, discovery, all of those things that I think should be part of the classroom. But it has been extracted from the classroom. I don't want to go into the history of why our classrooms across the board are places of monotony and of rote learning and of a denial of discovery. And how, when we talk about art education, this can be a space I would even say it can be an excuse for the education of a child to be made complete. Of course, we like, art to be in the service of all learning, but I think sometimes it deserves to be standalone also.
So, Mrs. Hashmi, that last point, I mean, I would like to actually process through it a bit more. And, traditionally, in many parts of the world, not just in Pakistan, the discussion of whether the arts, we can afford to teach them affordances of many kinds, not just financial, in the schooling of children, given how large the education sector is and how varied, and most of it is very, very, there are issues of access and resources and outreach. And so the discussion, the narrative of education through the arts, with the arts, in the arts, sort of gets bifurcated in whether the arts should be taught for their own sake, as you said, they should be sometimes, or in service of other disciplines, where you have, of course, developing aspirational, inclinations towards the inclusion of creativity in the curriculum. But is there ways in which we could make these two sort of streams more relational, more sort of iterative, and whereby, like we've already been through this discussion, art as excess or art education as an excessive thing, it's not necessarily something that you have to, there are other ways of looking at it. There are lower resource ways of, approaching arts education. What might we do in the Pakistani education context, to make this more connected?
I think this is a basic question that you asked, that where and how do you change the vision so that you realize that this is a very major component. And the fact that when we say art education, we are not talking about some kind of an area which is extra, but it is an area which is knitted into everything. And that comes about only when you have people who have an idea of what this actually means and what it incorporates, who are at the helm of affairs, or at least have an understanding when they come to designing the curriculum. I don't want to sort of point fingers right now, but I think the fact that a curriculum denies creativity means that there's a lack of understanding of what is missing. We understand that all of the subjects that have names and labels in the curriculum are essential. So children are put through them and they're examined at the end of it. But nobody really stops to think about the process by which all of this is delivered. And I think it is the process which is, where we find that art education becomes an intrinsic component of all learning. Yes, I do believe that it has to be separate also, but not so separate that you cannot see its efficacy in all learning. So which is why I think that this is where art educationists have to be part of all discussions which have to do with education. Because unless they make educationists aware of what we are talking about, I think there's going to be this gap, which is going to be persistent. The gap is very, very present as we see it now. And it's going to continue to widen. Because of course they think that these are the extras, add-ons in a school. And all that the art educationist is required to do is to make the school look pretty, to make sure that there are, a few nice pictures. So when somebody comes for an inspection, there's something laid out to look decorative. Or when there's an annual event, the art education can design the invitation cards. This is normally the way that it's looked at. But I think we're living in a very different world, Razia. We're living in a world in which every kid, you know, has this thing, okay? Art education or not, they're going to open it in the morning and they're going to see an image. And they're going to read things into that image. So we are forgetting that it is a very different world now in which every learner is being subjected to images all day long until they go to bed at night. They are making sense of the world and making sense of information through images. And art education, after all, is about the understanding of images, reading into images, the language of images. If that is not understood by educationists, then I think that, you know, they really need to go back to the drawing board. Because the times are gone when they're kind of trying to exclude, you know, what are labeled the arts from education. It's here and it's now. It's the fact that when you choose a car that you want to get into, there has been a designer at work over there. When you decide that you want, you know, to, as my wonderful teacher, Howard Hodgkin, the famous British artist, used to say, never mind if you don't become an artist, you'll always choose the right tie to go with your suit. And of course, I mean, he was being sort of, you know, a bit ironic and, you know, catty over there. But the fact remains that this is so much part of your education today that you cannot ignore it. It has to be part of the curriculum. It has to be something that children are taught along with mathematics and science, because they are now all intertwined. They're using these bits of technology. They have to understand the images that are being put forward. I mean, those of us who are listening to Dr. Azra the other day about her lecture on cancer, I mean, so much of what she was showing were all images. And I was wondering, you know, how many of us were au fait with the language of imagery, through which very complicated data was being put forward about a highly complex disease. We cannot avoid it. And I want to give a little anecdote, if I may. You know, a person my age is full of anecdotes. Many years ago, I was in the US, you know, I'd gone for my master's in art education. Just by chance, there was some conference, and there was, alongside that, there was a cardiologist conference. And so we kind of met up at coffee or something. And there was this gentleman who was a very well-known cardiologist. And when he heard I was from Pakistan, oh, he said, you know, some of my best colleagues are from Pakistan. So, and he said to me, he says, do you have art in school in Pakistan? Which I thought was rather an odd question coming from a, you know, extremely well-known heart specialist. So I said, mostly no. Why do you ask that? He said, you know, I was just wondering, because my colleagues from Pakistan who are tremendously sophisticated doctors, I sometimes seem to think that they lack a background in recognition of color. So that really stymied me. So he said, no, I'm not just saying that, but he said, you know, there's not that refined understanding of color that one expects in a person who's and the fact that he kind of put it down to a lack of art education, I really enjoyed that. And ever since then, I've always told this anecdote, maybe just totally anecdotal and, you know, just another piece of this, that, and the other. But the fact there is something lacking in a scientific education if there is not a high degree of understanding of the elements and principles of art and design. I think this is something that we need to ponder. And perhaps some of the people who are so pleased with their latest efforts and how they are going to add to the education of the school-going child need to look at that and need to understand what it is that they've actually railroaded out of the curriculum. because it's leading to a very starved and empty vessel.
So, Mrs. Hashmi, to build on that, like creativity is the sort of the rogue word, right? It keeps being used in non-arts. I mean, calling it arts education in Pakistan, I've noticed time and again that people shy away from it for all sorts of reasons, including sort of cultural taboos, religious taboos, etc. So, okay, so creativity is something that is surely aspired for, but how do we define it, or how do we build this sort of narrative, or build this sort of communication with whoever has the agency to decide what children learn? What is creativity? How might we, what is it that we're looking for, and how might we go about it? You worked for a long time, even at the policy level. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions, because this is a question I get asked in every class that I teach.
I wish I had worked at the policy level, but I have not. No, the thing is that these things, these changes, this understanding comes about through dialogue and through paying serious attention. First, to looking at the various components that go into making creativity possible, because you have to provide opportunities for creativity to thrive. I think when that opportunity is withdrawn, or it's really, really narrowed down, then of course you will find lack of creativity. I mean, what is creativity? Somebody once said, it's simply finding new solutions to old questions. The thing is that when curriculum is based on not asking questions, rather than asking questions, that is where you put the brakes on creativity immediately. All curriculums have to be designed so that they open up the opportunities for constant questioning. Questioning of the curriculum itself is very, very essential. It has to constantly evolve, and it will not evolve until the opportunities for questioning are there. And that goes for every single thing that you are putting into the construct of a curriculum. By its very definition, what art does is to make you realize that there is no one answer to hundreds of questions that are there in all learning, that there are many answers, and the pursuit of answers is what actually makes education. So until that is understood as a very basic way in which you commence work, you're going to have problems. Artists, as you know, are notoriously unamenable to being put into straitjackets. That is because they know that there are as many answers as there are people. They know it because that is the basis of what they do. And probably in my drawing classes, I used to say, there are two drawings that are looking alike, there's something really, really wrong over here. Can you say that in any other class? You can't, can you? When you're looking for uniformity of answers. So that's the problem there. You cannot have uniformity of answers. And that's a very major issue, I know. That is at the core of creativity.
Thank you, Mrs. Hashmi. I have many more questions, but I will now open it up to the floor. And there have already been two questions about curriculum, but I think that you've addressed them. If students or colleagues, if have questions, we have about 10, 12 minutes for that. Please go ahead. Ji, Dr. Bari.
So, Professor Hashmi, ये बताइए कि this was my experience also when I went to abroad after doing my OA levels here or whatever, traditional schools, I went abroad. And one of the first things that really struck me was the sensibility of a student like myself, compared to a student that was coming even from mainstream schools in England, the big difference was that all of them had been exposed to music, singing, extra languages, and art in various ways. And therefore, their entire sensibility of even doing logic or mathematics even was very different. I mean, could you elaborate a little bit more on what that difference is? Because I've never been able to pinpoint it too much. And then think about how that reflects back into, say, the primary level or secondary level curriculum, and what does it mean for our education going on here?
Well, I think you've touched at the core of the problem. You know, we have 5 senses, okay? How many of them are employed in the classroom, actually, in the kind of classrooms we have? We talk about music that has to do with sound. I found one of the best ways to engage children is to vary the sound that they are exposed to. Counting rhythm to rhythm rather than counting by learning. The sound of every kind that you can possibly talk about. Soft sounds, loud sounds, the music. Why is poetry so engaging? Precisely for that reason, that the cadence of the language alters and you are exposed to different kinds of rhythms. So sound is terribly important. You taught, and art is about the visual. So the eye is engaged, and information and learning and study and coming to certain kinds of conclusions come from what your eyes tell you. You know, I was telling you, आसमान नीला है. अरे भाई बाहर खड़े होके देखो आसमान नीला है कि नहीं है? नहीं है. So what are you learning? What are you teaching the child when you say आसमान नीला है? And so on. I mean, these are sort of silly small examples. But this is precisely it. Through art, you learn about the sense of touch. Surfaces are rough, surfaces are smooth, surfaces, your eyes tell you certain surfaces are shiny, certain surfaces are dull. I remember there is an art education. I was appearing for a job in the public school system in London, and they were not very sure whether they should take an art educationist rather than somebody who would come out of the School of Education. And they said, you know, what will you give to the children? I said, I teach them comparisons, you know. You say, is this, stand in the light, is your shadow long or is it short? Why is it long? Why is it short? And so on and so forth. So they were, of course, were immediately delighted and said, they offered me the job right away. But that's just because, you know, I felt that I'd be adding something to. But it is precisely what you said. It is the use of all of your senses, those that you are lucky enough to have. And therefore, you have a far more sophisticated knowledge of the world because you have employed all of yourself in the learning. And that's it. That's it. Is denying a child all of the ways that they could possibly learn. And then so many studies of how children who have had this kind of an advantage of visual learning, how certain kinds of intelligences grow much faster, and children who may otherwise not learn so well in the formal system do exceptionally well in the informal system.
This reminds me of Ken Robinson's talk where he says that education teaches us the neck up. So essentially, so there's no holistic full body, full, you know, and there's a division also between mind, body, so which is like a very old dated idea. Momin, you have a question.
Yeah, I didn't have a question, but I just had a comment. Like when, so Professor Hashmi, when you mentioned that everybody has a phone now, and I think that I think meme culture is something that is perhaps a completely new art form जो पहले exist नहीं करती थी, and it's a completely different avenue, and I think it has given people an opportunity to make art जो शायद सोशल मीडिया अगर ना होता तो वो आर्ट कभी ना बनाते या कभी सोचते हैं ना वो क्रिएटिवली. So it's very interesting how with मतलब because I think it's one of those things कि हम like sometimes we think कि अच्छा हम जिस एज में हैं हमने सब कुछ डिस्कवर कर लिया जो करना था, like सब कुछ जो होना था वो हो गया है, but then we continue to see new things coming up, and I think we're still in the process of recognizing, for example, memes as another form of art, and additionally I would also say कि like you said, even अगर school की curriculum में art education nahi be integrated, I think it's something that one personally also discovers. Like in my undergraduate degree, I remember for one of my political science courses, मैंने जो Greek economic crisis हुआ था वो मैंने YouTube पे देखा था, किसी ने explain किया हुआ through visuals and through art or and the only reason I was able to answer that question in the exam was because मुझे उसके visuals अच्छी तरह याद थे, जिसकी वजह से मुझे story याद थी. So even if मुझे school वो college में नहीं उस visuals के through पढ़ाया था, मैंने खुद वो access कर लिया because it was on the internet. So yeah, just wanted to make that comment.
Oh, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, there's a whole new way of making images, of being creative through imagery that we create from a host of sources, and name absolutely that. And I'm a great fan of, you know, what's happening and what is unfolding now, because I think it's giving access to a whole generation which otherwise would not have not had any schooling in it. They were deprived of it. But now that the opportunity is there, they're suddenly investigating parts of themselves and parts of their minds and their imagination, which they never had the chance to do before. And they're doing so tremendously well because there is the excitement of finding out these things and actually expressing and discovering that you can do it. You know, you don't have to go to NCA to be an expert at that, but you can do it. And that is something that one finds constantly. And if one gives, especially if one works with children, you find that given the opportunity, they will surprise you, you know, absolutely. And they will, I've learned what I've learned in my life through my students. You know, I doubt if I gave them very much, but I certainly learned tremendous amount from seeing how they could add to my knowledge and my understanding. So yes, it's a whole new generation that is going to be creative because they've been allowed the tools of creativity. And because TikTok has been banned today, we know that it creates subversion. And subversion is the mother of creativity.
Okay, so we have time for one last question. Kamran.
जी शुक्रिया. शुक्रिया सलीमा साहबा आपकी यहाँ मौजूदगी का. हमेशा अच्छा लगता है उम्मीद की बात सुन के और आर्ट्स की बात सुन के. मेरा बस एक छोटा सा सवाल है कि जिस तरह फैज साहब ने कहा था कि हम एक उम्र से वाकिफ़ हैं, अब ना समझाओ कि लुत्फ़ क्या है मेरे मेहरबान, सितम क्या है. तो आप समझती हैं कि ये लुत्फ़ और सितम के मानी या जो आर्ट्स को देखने का एक नज़रिया है वो आज के दौर में तब्दील हो चुका है, या वही तौर तरीके हमें आज भी अगर हम अपनाएं तो हम आर्ट्स को उस नज़र से यानी उसको पजीराई देने में मदद हासिल कर सकते हैं, कोई किरदार अदा कर सकते हैं? आपका ज़ाती ख्याल क्या है इस बारे में?
मेरे ख्याल में कुछ चीज़ें तो नहीं बदलती. इंसान जो है वो वही है, मगर उसका जो लवाज़मात ज़िंदगी है वो बिल्कुल बदल जाती है. और जैसा कि अभी बात हो रही थी, जो कहा गया कि भाई चूँकि तौर तरीके मुख्तलिफ हो गए हैं, तो बहुत सारी ऐसी चीज़ें हैं जिनको आप खातिर में कभी नहीं लाते थे, लेकिन वो बहुत सारी अहमियत इख्तियार कर गए हैं. इसका ये मतलब नहीं है कि लुत्फ़ कम या ज़्यादा हो सकता है. मेरे ख्याल में कि मौक़े मुख्तलिफ हैं, लेकिन ये ज़रूर है कि किसी ज़माने में ये सोचा जाता था कि भाई शायद सिर्फ एक तबका है जिनके लिए ये चीज़ें जिनको ये चीज़ें मुयस्सर हैं. हालांकि हमें बिल्कुल पता है कि भाई हर तबके में बहुत मुश्किल और कठिन हालात में भी कोई ना कोई ऐसी चीज़ होती है जिसके ज़रिए ज़िंदगी सहल हो सकती है. कुछ ऐसी जिंदगियां भी हैं जिनकी ज़िंदगी कभी सहल नहीं होती, हमें ये भी मालूम है. और आजकल तो ख़ास तौर पे चूँकि इंफॉर्मेशन का दौर जो है वो इस कदर हम पे पड़ा है, तो कभी कभी बहुत मायूसी होती है। मुझे लगता है कि ज़्यादातर लोगों की ज़िंदगी, और इस दौर में जो पेंडेमिक का दौर है, ज़्यादातर ज़िंदगी में लुत्फ की बहुत कमी आ गई। बट आई डू बिलीव in the power of human beings to make life livable for themselves and for other people. And I think कि जिस चीज़ की हम बात कर रहे हैं, फन की, आर्ट की, शायरी की, मौसीकी की, अगर आपके पास इंस्ट्रूमेंट नहीं है लेकिन आपकी आवाज़ जो है दूर तक जाती है। मैंने ये किस्सा कई दफ़ा सुना है कि अपने स्टूडेंट्स को BNU के जो अक्सर कहते हैं ना वो बर्गर बच्चे हैं, उनको ले गई थी अहमदाबाद, और बाजार में घूमते हुए सडनली कान के बीच में बुल्ले शाह की आवाज़, बुल्ले शाह नहीं सॉरी कोई हीर गा रहा था, बड़ी खूबसूरत। देखा एक बाबा बैठा है, कोने बैठा है, और हम सब खड़े हो गए, और ये बच्चे बिल्कुल से कहते हैं कि सकते में आ गए, because here was a beautiful voice of an old man sitting in Ahmedabad and reciting Heer, and you understood the nature of beauty, and you understood the nature of human beings' ability to be creative, whatever the circumstances. So मेरा ख्याल है कि कुछ चीज़ें बदली हैं बिल्कुल, लेकिन कुछ चीज़ें मेरे ख्याल में मुस्तकिल हमारे साथ, और वही चीज़ें हैं मेरे ख्याल में जिन पे अपना यकीन रखना चाहिए।
Thank you, Professor Hashmi, for ending on that hopeful note, because I think that is something which I feel is really important in all of education, but certainly for arguing the case for having some form of engagement with the arts moving forward. So we'll continue to talk about this in various forums. Thank you so much for your time, and it was a pleasure. And thank you all for attending and taking out time. Please look out for 2 more talks on related issues. One is on design research and the other one is on theater and education coming up in the next few weeks. So we hope to see you again. Khudafiz and bye-bye. Thank you, Mrs. Hashmi.
Thank you, Khudafiz.